Chapter 14 is looking at the Civil War. It's obviously still within Period 5, which is using the Civil War as the framework for the entire era from 1844 to 1877. Here, as always, we won't be so concerned about the war itself in terms of military history, but rather we're much more concerned with the social and political effects of the war. That said, we're going to begin with something of an examination of the war itself. So, essential question one is, why is the Civil War considered the first modern war? There are several reasons for this. The first one is that during the Civil War, both sides made use of industrial weaponry, and that resulted in extreme casualties on both sides. There was also the introduction of new technologies like railroads, the telegraph, more accurate firearms, etc., that made this war much deadlier. And in fact, almost as many people died in the Civil War as in all other U.S. wars combined. At the time, 25% of men who left to fight in the war never returned home. And another reason that there were extreme casualties was due to poor medical care and the spread of disease. The bottom line was that the conditions on the battlefield and in field hospitals was incredibly unsanitary, and it allowed for disease to spread very quickly, and if you were wounded, it was likely that your wound would become infected, and that could kill you. Other things that made the Civil War the first modern war was that there were fewer distinctions between soldiers and civilians, thus widening the death toll to non-combatants, and this will be a characteristic of future wars moving forward. Something else that makes this the first modern war is that the ability to mobilize economic resources was absolutely crucial, resembling, in a way, the total warfare that will be fought by world powers in, say, World War I and World War II later on in the 20th century. And speaking to that importance of the mobilization of economic resources, it's valuable to take a moment to look at the two sides in the conflict, the North and the South, or the Union and the Confederacy, looking at their advantages and disadvantages. So, Northern advantages. They had a higher population, in fact a much higher population. There were 2.5 times more people in the North than there were in the South. And that means more people to fight, certainly, but also more people to produce economically. Also, the North has greater manufacturing power than does the South. We know that because of the market revolution, which benefited the North far more than it did the South, that's going to mean that manufacturing in the North has grown much, much larger than it has in the South. In fact, the manufacturing capacity of the North is something like 9 times that of the South at the outbreak of the war, and that means that the North is simply going to be better able to supply their troops than the South will be. Also, we've already talked about this before, the North has invested more in railroads than the South has, giving them a better ability to transport troops and supplies. And finally, the North simply has greater financial resources that they can use to pay for much needed war materials. The South has far fewer advantages over the North, but they are worth mentioning. So the Confederacy, first of all, needed only to hold out against an invasion by the North and conquest, meaning that they really only had to fight a defensive war. And in many respects, a lot of Confederates saw themselves as their fighting of this war as similar to that of the Revolutionary War, in which they don't actually have to conquer the enemy, but they simply have to hold out long enough for the enemy to admit defeat and to recognize their independence. And Confederates were hoping to be able to do that in this war. Secondly, Southerners tended to be highly motivated fighters who felt that they were defending their homes, their families, and their way of life. They had more of a purpose behind fighting than arguably the Union did at the beginning of the war. But the war stirred patriotic feelings on both sides, and there was initially a lot of people that signed up at the very beginning. However, both sides, the Union and the Confederacy, ultimately had to institute a draft to pull soldiers in by law as enthusiasm and enlistment waned in the opening days of the war. And really quick, I want to go ahead and mention something because it'll come up repeatedly and it's an important social effect of the war. The Civil War at the time was referred to by some as, quote, a rich man's war but a poor man's fight, end quote. In other words, the war was perceived to have been started by wealthier interest and was being fought by the lower classes. And that perception comes mostly from the fact that wealthy elites in the North and the South could avoid the draft by virtue of their wealth. So in the North, for example, wealthy people could pay a $300 draft substitution fee. In other words, rather than being drafted, they could pay $300 to hire a substitute that would go to fight in their place. $300 was an exorbitant sum at the time. Likewise, in the South, wealthy people could get out of the Confederate draft because their draft had a quote 20 Negro provision, which exempted one white male for every 20 slaves on a plantation. And what that means, in other words, is that if you were one of those wealthy plantation owners that owned 20 or more slaves, and it's a very small fraction of the Southern population, you would be exempt from the draft. The idea being that a wealthy plantation owner in this context was crucial to the economic productivity of the Confederacy and should be back home steering that rather than on the front lines fighting the war. Before wrapping up this question, we want to look at a couple of battles in the opening of the Civil War. And I know that normally we don't look at battles, and that's because this is not a military history test that you're preparing for. However, we do look at battles when they serve as major turning points in a war. And there are two here that are important milestones in the Civil War that are very much worth knowing and understanding the social effects of. The first battle that you should know from the early days of the war is the Battle of Bull Run in 1861. This battle starts with an early Union effort to take the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. This effort fails and Union troops chaotically retreat back to the U.S. Capitol, and both sides see very high casualties. And why this is a milestone is because it signals to both sides that the war would not be short as it was expected to be, and that it would be much deadlier than either side expected. The second battle to know from the early days of the Civil War is the Battle of Antietam in 1862. Here, the Union managed to repel a Confederate invasion of the North, and this battle sees massive casualties. And this is a symptom of those technological advancements that allowed both sides to kill one another in extreme numbers. But the statistics here are pretty staggering. More people were killed, injured, or wounded in the Battle of Antietam than in all other American wars combined in the 1800s. But it's not the casualty rate or the death toll that makes this so notable. The reason that the Battle of Antietam is worth remembering is that first, it helped persuade England and France to stay neutral in the war rather than getting involved. And in fact, the South had hoped to get diplomatic recognition from either England or France, or maybe even get assistance from those countries, because they hoped that Southern cotton was so crucial to French and British manufacturing that they would have no choice but to support the Confederacy to keep those exports coming in. But ultimately, this Union victory here convinces the British and the French to stay out of the war. But most importantly, what makes the Battle of Antietam such a milestone and the most important battle of the Civil War for you to remember is that the victory by the Union here persuaded Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. We'll talk more about that in a little bit, but Lincoln was waiting for a major Union victory to issue this proclamation to free the slaves.